England, 1839. The season had arrived in London with all the glittering promise and veiled treachery that characterized the upper echelons of English society. In the grand ballrooms where fortunes were made and reputations destroyed with equal swiftness, where crystal chandeliers cast their golden light upon silk gowns, worth more than a working man's lifetime earnings, there existed an unspoken hierarchy as rigid as any law. At the very pinnacle of this glittering pyramid stood one man, a figure so powerful, so utterly commanding, that his mere presence could alter the course of an evening, a business venture, or an entire family's future. Duke Alaric Blackthorne, the Duke of Renford, was not simply a nobleman. He was an institution, a force of nature wrapped in impeccably tailored superfine, and an aura of danger that made even the bravest men think twice before crossing him. The Blackthorne estate sprawled across thousands of acres in the north, a testament to generations of shrewd marriages, strategic alliances, and an almost supernatural ability to emerge victorious from every political upheaval that had shaken England for the past 3 centuries. But it was not merely inherited wealth that made Alaric formidable. He possessed a mind as sharp as any blade, capable of dissecting complex financial arrangements in moments, of reading men's intentions in the flicker of an eye, of calculating risk and reward with the precision of a master chess player who could see 20 moves ahead. He had multiplied his already substantial fortune through investments in railways, shipping concerns, and manufacturing enterprises that scandalized the more traditional peers who believed a true gentleman should never dirty his hands with commerce. Alaric cared nothing for their opinions. He cared only for power, for control, for the intoxicating certainty that he commanded his own destiny and, by extension, influenced the destinies of countless others. His physical presence matched his reputation in every particular. Standing well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to strain even the most expertly cut coat, he moved through the world with the confidence of a man who had never encountered an obstacle he could not overcome. His features were carved in sharp aristocratic lines, a strong jaw that suggested both determination and a certain cruelty, high cheekbones that spoke of generations of careful breeding, and a mouth that rarely curved into a genuine smile. But it was his eyes that truly unsettled people. Grey as smoke over winter fields, they possessed an intensity that seemed to pierce through social niceties and polite conversation to examine the very soul beneath. Women found them hypnotic. Men found them unnerving. Everyone who met Duke Alaric Blackthorne's gaze felt seen in a way that was simultaneously thrilling and terrifying. He had reached the age of 32 without marrying, a situation that had caused endless speculation among the matchmaking mamas of London society. Countless beautiful daughters of excellent families had been paraded before him, each one hoping to become the Duchess of Renford, to claim the ultimate prize in the marriage market. He had shown polite interest in none of them, cool indifference to most, and had never once indicated that any woman had succeeded in capturing his attention beyond the superficial pleasures that his wealth and position afforded him. The truth, though he would never have admitted it, was that Alaric had grown unutterably bored with the predictable patterns of courtship, with women who simpered and agreed with his every word, who saw only his title and fortune, who would have married him had he been 80 years old and riddled with disease, simply for the privilege of being called Duchess. Then he had encountered Lady Isolde Pemberton, and for the first time in his carefully controlled existence, Duke Alaric Blackthorne had felt something shift beneath his feet. The Pemberton family occupied a respectable, if not exalted, position in society. They were old blood, their lineage traceable back to the Norman conquest, but financial misfortunes and a series of unfortunate marriages had diminished their wealth considerably over the generations. Isolde's father, Lord Edmund Pemberton, was a scholar more interested in ancient manuscripts than in managing his estates. A gentle, abstracted man who seemed perpetually surprised to find himself responsible for a family and property. Her mother had died when Isolde was but 7 years old, leaving her to be raised largely by a succession of governesses and her father's extensive library. This unconventional upbringing had produced an equally unconventional young woman. Lady Isolde possessed the kind of beauty that revealed itself gradually, that grew more compelling the longer one looked. Her features were not the perfectly symmetrical porcelain regularity so prized in fashionable beauties. Instead, her face held character, intelligence, a certain strength in the line of her jaw, and the directness of her gaze that suggested she would not be easily swayed or intimidated. Her hair was a rich chestnut brown that caught auburn highlights in the sun, usually arranged with more practicality than artistry, as if she had more important things to consider than whether each curl was perfectly positioned. Her eyes were her most arresting feature, a deep hazel that shifted between brown and green depending on her mood and the light, framed by dark lashes and level brows that rarely descended into coy fluttering. She stood taller than most women of her acquaintance, moved with an unstudied grace that suggested complete comfort in her own body, and possessed a voice that carried the musical quality of genuine intelligence rather than the affected tones so many young ladies adopted. But it was not her appearance that made Isolde remarkable. It was her mind. Years of unrestricted access to her father's library had given her an education far beyond what most women of her class received. She read Latin and Greek, could discuss philosophy and politics with an understanding that would have shamed many gentlemen, possessed opinions on everything from the corn laws to the proper classification of botanical specimens, and had absolutely no patience for the sort of vapid conversation that dominated most social gatherings. She did not simper or giggle. She did not pretend ignorance to flatter male egos. She spoke her mind with a directness that some found refreshing and others found deeply unsettling. At 23, she had already refused 2 perfectly acceptable proposals of marriage, much to her father's bewildered disappointment and the scandalized fascination of society matrons, who could not fathom why a young woman of modest fortune would dare to be so selective. Their first meeting had occurred at a dinner party, hosted by the Countess of Ashworth, one of those carefully orchestrated affairs where placement at table was a matter of such strategic importance that wars had been fought with less planning. Alaric had found himself seated beside Lady Isolde, a position he initially regarded with his customary indifference. He had learned long ago to navigate dinner conversation with the minimum of actual engagement, to nod at appropriate moments, to make non-committal sounds of agreement, to let his mind wander to more pressing matters while maintaining the appearance of polite attention. Isolde had shattered that comfortable pattern within the first 5 minutes. "I understand you have made considerable investments in railway expansion, Your Grace," she had said, her voice calm and direct, without the breathless quality most young women adopted when addressing him. "I have been following the debates in Parliament regarding the proposed line through the Midlands. Do you believe the projected returns justify the disruption to established agricultural communities, or is this simply another instance of progress trampling tradition without adequate consideration of human cost?" Alaric had turned to look at her fully for the first time, genuinely startled. Women did not ask him about railway investments. Women asked him about his estates, his horses, his opinions on the weather, his plans for the season. They certainly did not challenge the fundamental premises of his business decisions in the opening moments of conversation. "I was not aware that young ladies of quality concerned themselves with railway economics," he had replied, his tone carrying just enough edge to warn most people away from pursuing the topic further. Isolde had smiled, and it had been a smile of amusement rather than flirtation, as if she found his response exactly what she had expected, and exactly as disappointing as she had anticipated. "I concern myself with many things, Your Grace. I find the world far too interesting to limit my attention to needlework and the latest fashions, but if you prefer to discuss something less substantial, I am sure I can manage an adequate performance of vapid conversation. Shall I comment on the excellence of the soup, the fineness of the weather, the crush at the last assembly?" Something had sparked in Alaric's chest at that moment, an unfamiliar sensation that took him several seconds to identify as genuine interest. Here was a woman who not only refused to be intimidated by his rank and reputation, but seemed actively determined to provoke him. It was novel. It was unexpected. It was, he had to admit, rather exhilarating. "I think," he had said slowly, his grey eyes fixing on her with the full intensity of his attention, "that you are a rather unusual young woman, Lady Isolde." "I shall take that as a compliment, Your Grace, though I suspect you did not entirely mean it as one." They had talked throughout the dinner, A real conversation such as Alaric could not remember having with a woman in years, perhaps ever. She challenged his assumptions, offered perspectives he had not considered, demonstrated a grasp of economic principles that would have impressed his man of business, and did it all without the slightest hint of coquetry or any apparent awareness that she was behaving in a manner society would deem wholly inappropriate for a young unmarried lady. By the time the ladies withdrew to leave the gentlemen to their port, Alaric had made a decision that seemed both perfectly logical and utterly unprecedented. He would marry Lady Isolde Pemberton. It was not love, he told himself. Alaric did not believe in love, considered it a weak emotion unworthy of serious consideration, something poets invented to excuse irrational behavior. But it was fascination, genuine intellectual compatibility, and the recognition that this woman would never bore him, would never become just another decorative possession in his collection of fine things. She would be a partner, someone with whom he could actually converse, someone who would challenge him and keep him engaged. The fact that she was also attractive in her unconventional way, that watching intelligence flicker across her expressive features stirred something in him beyond mere physical appreciation, was simply an additional advantage. He had called upon Lord Edmund Pemberton the very next morning, a visit that had clearly flustered Isolde's father, who had emerged from his library with ink-stained fingers and a distracted air, obviously trying to remember who exactly the Duke of Renford was and why such an important personage would be calling at his modest townhouse. Alaric had stated his intentions with characteristic directness. He wished to marry Lady Isolde. He could offer her everything, wealth beyond imagining, a position at the very pinnacle of society, estates, jewels, influence, security for her father and any future children. It was, by any objective measure, the most advantageous match imaginable for a young woman of her circumstances. Lord Edmund had blinked at him with owlish confusion. "Well, Your Grace, I must confess you have taken me quite by surprise. Isolde is, of course, my greatest treasure, my late wife's precious gift to me. I have always maintained that she should choose her own path in this matter, that the dictates of the heart should supersede considerations of rank or fortune. But I cannot deny that your offer is extraordinarily generous. I shall naturally discuss this with my daughter, and convey her response to you with all appropriate haste." What neither man could have predicted was that Isolde's response would be delivered not through her father's diplomatic channels, but directly, publicly, and with a finality that would shock all of London society. The occasion was the Rothschild Ball, one of the most prestigious events of the season, attended by everyone who mattered in society. The ballroom blazed with the light of 1,000 candles reflected in gilded mirrors, the air thick with the mingled scents of hothouse flowers, expensive perfumes, and the peculiar mixture of anticipation and barely suppressed gossip that characterized such gatherings. Alaric had arrived with the expectation that Lord Edmund would have spoken to his daughter, that some private understanding would be reached, that the formal announcement of their engagement would follow within days. He had not expected Isolde herself to approach him in full view of several hundred of their closest social connections. She had looked magnificent that evening, her gown a deep emerald silk that brought out the green in her hazel eyes, her hair arranged with unusual care, her bearing that of a young woman who had made a difficult decision and was prepared to face its consequences. She had walked directly up to him, ignoring the scandalous breach of protocol such directness represented, and had spoken in a voice pitched loud enough for those nearest to hear, though not so loud as to create an obvious scene. "Your Grace, I understand that you have done me the honor of speaking to my father regarding a possible union between us. I wish to address this matter with you directly, as I believe honesty, particularly in affairs of such importance, serves everyone better than diplomatic evasion." She had paused, and in that pause, Alaric had felt the first stirrings of unease, a sensation so unfamiliar that he almost did not recognize it. "I must respectfully decline your generous offer. I do not wish to marry you, Your Grace. I do not believe we would suit, despite the considerable advantages such a match would offer. I hope you will accept my decision with the grace and dignity that befits a man of your position." The world had seemed to stop. Conversations within earshot had died mid-sentence. Fans had frozen in mid-flutter. Every eye within range had turned to witness the Duke of Renford's reaction to something that had never happened to him before. something that most people would have insisted could not happen. Rejection. Public, unequivocal, devastating rejection. Alaric had felt the blood drain from his face, then rush back in a hot wave of humiliation and fury, such as he had never experienced. No one refused him. No one would dare. And yet this woman, this impudent, ungrateful, impossible woman, stood before him with her chin raised and her eyes steady, having just delivered the most public insult imaginable. His hands had clenched at his sides, his jaw tightening until he felt his teeth might crack from the pressure. He had wanted to rage, to demand explanations, to insist that she was making a catastrophic mistake. But he was Duke Alaric Blackthorne, and dukes did not create scenes in ballrooms, no matter how richly deserved the provocation. "I see," he had managed, his voice emerging cold and flat as a frozen lake. "Then I shall trouble you no further, Lady Isolde. I wish you every happiness in your future endeavors, whatever they may be." He had turned and walked away, each step requiring more control than negotiating his most difficult business deal, feeling the weight of hundreds of stares on his back, hearing the immediate explosion of whispered speculation that would, he knew, spread through London society like wildfire. By morning, everyone would know. The Duke of Renford had been refused, the untouchable had been touched, had been struck, had been wounded in the most public manner possible. It was intolerable. It was unforgivable. It was, he swore as he strode from that ballroom into the cool night air, something that Lady Isolde Pemberton would come to regret with every fibre of her being. He had left London that very night, riding north to his estate with a fury that drove him harder than any whip. For weeks he remained at Blackthorne Hall, refusing all visitors, conducting his business through correspondence, nursing his wounded pride like a physical injury. He told himself he would forget her, that she was merely an aberration, an unpleasant episode best put behind him. He told himself he would find another woman to marry, someone more suitable, more grateful for the honor he would bestow upon her. He told himself that Lady Isolde Pemberton meant nothing to him, that her refusal was simply a temporary setback, an annoyance rather than a true blow. He lied to himself with increasing desperation as the weeks became months, and he discovered that he could not stop thinking about her, could not forget the intelligence in her eyes, the strength in her bearing, the way she had challenged him, provoked him, made him feel truly alive for the first time in years. What he felt was not love, he insisted. It was simply unfinished business, an equation that had not been properly resolved. And Duke Alaric Blackthorne always resolved his equations. Meanwhile, in London, Isolde faced the consequences of her decision with rather more composure than anyone expected. She had known that refusing the Duke would cause a scandal, had understood that many would consider her decision the height of foolishness, that her father would be disappointed and confused, that her prospects for other advantageous matches would likely diminish. She had weighed all of these factors carefully, and had concluded that none of them mattered as much as the preservation of her own autonomy, her own self. The truth was that Duke Alaric Blackthorne had terrified her, not because of his reputation or his power, but because during their single evening of conversation, she had felt something stirring within her that she had never experienced before. It was not simple attraction, though she could not deny that his physical presence had affected her in ways that made her pulse quicken and her breath catch. It was something deeper, more dangerous, a recognition that this man could unravel all her carefully constructed defenses, could make her want things she had never permitted herself to want, could consume her entirely if she allowed him into her life. He was too much, too intense, too overwhelming. She had seen in his eyes a possessiveness that suggested once he claimed something, he never let it go. And Isolde had fought too hard for her independence, had struggled too long against society's expectations of what a woman should be and do, to surrender that precious freedom to any man, no matter how compelling. So she had refused him, and in doing so had set in motion a chain of events that would change both their lives in ways neither could have anticipated. The months passed with the usual rhythm of London society. The scandal of Isolde's refusal gradually faded as newer, fresher scandals emerged to capture the ton's attention. Isolde resumed her usual activities, attending fewer balls but more lectures, spending time in her father's library, writing essays on subjects that interested her, living a life that many would have found unbearably quiet, but which she found perfectly satisfying. She told herself she had made the right decision, that she was content, that she did not think about Duke Alaric at all. She told herself that the dreams which sometimes woke her in the dark hours before dawn, dreams in which grey eyes looked at her with an intensity that made her whole body ache, meant nothing whatsoever. Then, in the spring of the following year, Lord Edmund had emerged from his library with an expression of such profound relief that Isolde had immediately known something significant had occurred. Her father had received a visitor, he explained, a gentleman of excellent character and comfortable fortune, who had expressed serious interest in courting Isolde with a view toward marriage. Lord Hartley was the second son of the Earl of Devonshire, a pleasant man in his middle 30s, who had recently inherited a substantial estate from a bachelor uncle. He had heard of Lady Isolde's intelligence and accomplishments, her father reported with barely contained delight, and was eager to meet a young woman whose interests extended beyond the typical feminine pursuits. He understood that Isolde was unconventional and admired that quality rather than deploring it. He seemed, in short, absolutely perfect. The courtship that followed was everything proper, everything appropriate, everything that society approved. Lord Hartley called at the prescribed times, brought thoughtful gifts, including several rare books for Isolde's collection, engaged her in intelligent conversation, expressed interest in her opinions, treated her with respect and genuine warmth. He was handsome in a pleasant way, kind, stable, utterly reliable. He made no demands, exerted no pressure, gave her space to be herself. After several weeks of such attentions, he had formally requested permission to propose marriage, and Lord Edmund, seeing his daughter's apparent contentment with the arrangement, had readily agreed. The engagement announcement appeared in the morning papers on a Tuesday in late April. By that afternoon, the news had spread through every drawing room and club in London. And by that evening, Duke Alaric Blackthorne had returned to the city for the first time in 8 months, riding through the streets toward the Pemberton townhouse with a determination that caused his staff to exchange worried glances and scatter from his path. Isolde was in the library when she heard the commotion, the sound of raised voices from the entrance hall, her father's confused protestations, and then heavy footsteps approaching with the inexorability of approaching thunder. She had time to rise from her chair, time to turn toward the door, time to draw a single breath before the library door crashed open and Duke Alaric Blackthorne strode into the room like an avenging angel, clothed in impeccably tailored black superfine and barely contained fury. He looked different from how she remembered. Thinner, perhaps, with sharper angles to his already sharp features, new lines around his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and difficult months. His hair was slightly disheveled, as if he had been running his hands through it repeatedly. But his eyes, those storm-grey eyes, held the same intensity she remembered, now focused entirely on her, with a force that made her instinctively step backward until her legs hit the chair behind her. "You are not marrying him." His voice was low, rough, absolutely certain. Not a question, a declaration. Isolde drew herself up to her full height, fighting to keep her voice steady, despite the way her heart was attempting to hammer its way out of her chest. "I beg your pardon, Your Grace, but my marital arrangements are none of your concern. You have no right to burst into my father's house making demands. I must ask you to leave immediately." He moved closer, and she found herself unable to retreat further, trapped between the chair and his advancing presence. He stopped perhaps 2 feet from her, close enough that she could see the pulse beating in his throat, could catch the scent of leather and something darker, more masculine, that made her head swim slightly. "You refused me," he said, and there was something raw in his voice now, something beneath the anger that sounded almost like pain. "You stood in that ballroom and told me you did not wish to marry me, that we would not suit. You humiliated me before all of society, sent me away like a dismissed servant, and now you accept the proposal of that insignificant nobody, that pallid excuse for a gentleman who could not begin to give you what I could offer." "Lord Hartley is kind," Isolde replied, hating the way her voice wanted to tremble, forcing it to remain firm. "He is respectful. He treats me as an equal, not as a possession to be acquired. He does not seek to dominate or control. He offers partnership, not subjugation. Partnership, Alaric repeated, and the word dripped with contempt. You want tepid companionship and polite conversation. You want some gentle fool who will pat your hand and nod at your opinions and bore you to tears within a year. That is what you prefer over what I offered you? Yes. The word burst from her with more force than she intended. Yes, I prefer kindness and respect to arrogance and possession. I prefer to be valued for myself rather than pursued, because I had the audacity to refuse you. I know why you are here, Your Grace. It is not because you care for me. It is because your pride cannot tolerate that someone dared to say no, that someone slipped through your fingers, that you could not have what you wanted simply by reaching for it. You know nothing about what I want. His hands came up, and for a moment she thought he would grab her, would shake her, would do something violent and unforgivable. Instead, his fingers clenched in the air between them, trembling with the force of whatever he was restraining. You think I have thought of nothing but you for 8 months because of wounded pride. You think I have been unable to sleep, unable to concentrate, unable to feel anything but this consuming need to see you, to speak with you, to make you understand, because of some petty concern about my reputation. Isolde stared at him, shocked by the admission she heard beneath his words. Then why? She whispered. Why do you care? Why does it matter? His laugh was harsh, bitter, devoid of any humor. Because you are in my head, in my blood, in every thought I have. Because I have tried to forget you, tried to convince myself you meant nothing, tried to find interest in other women, in my work, in anything that might drive your image from my mind, and I cannot. Because when I read that you had accepted another man's proposal, I felt something break inside me that I did not even know existed. Is that what you wanted to hear, Lady Isolde? That you have reduced me to this? That you have unmade? The man I was and left me grasping for something I cannot even name? The silence that followed his outburst seemed to pulse with unspoken things, with possibilities and dangers, and the weight of decisions that could not be unmade. Isolde felt as if she stood on the edge of a precipice, knowing that her next words would determine whether she stepped back to safety or leaped into the unknown. I refused you, she said quietly, because I was afraid. Not of you, precisely, but of what being with you would mean. I saw how you looked at me as if I were a puzzle you intended to solve, a challenge you intended to overcome. I saw possession in your eyes, Your Grace, and the certainty that once you claimed me, I would cease to be Isolde and become simply the Duchess of Renford, an extension of your will rather than a person in my own right. I refused you because I knew that if I accepted, I would lose myself entirely. And this Lord Hartley? Alaric said, his voice dropping to something dangerous and soft. He will not consume you. He will leave you free to be yourself? Yes, Isolde replied, but even she could hear the uncertainty in that single word. Alaric leaned closer, so close she could feel the heat of his body, could see the silver threads in his grey eyes, could feel her resolve beginning to crack under the weight of his proximity. You are lying. To me or to yourself I am not certain, but you are lying nonetheless. You will marry this tepid gentleman, and you will be safe, and you will be comfortable, and you will die slowly of boredom and unfulfilled longing, and in 20 years you will look back and wonder why you chose fear over passion, safety over life. And if I chose you? The question escaped before she could stop it, barely a whisper but loud enough in the charged silence between them. What then? Would you treasure me or possess me? Would you love me or simply refuse to lose? Can you even tell the difference, Your Grace? For the first time since entering the room, Alaric seemed at a loss. His jaw worked as if he were trying to formulate words that refused to come, his hands falling slowly to his sides. I do not know, he finally admitted, and the honesty in those words struck her harder than any declaration of love could have. I have never felt for anyone what I feel for you. I do not know if what I feel is love, as poets describe it, or simply an obsession born of being denied what I desire. I know only that the thought of you belonging to another man makes me want to tear the world apart. I know that I would give you everything I have, everything I am, if you would but give me a chance to prove that what I feel is real. I am engaged to Lord Hartley, Isolde said, but the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. The announcement has been made. To break the engagement now would ruin me socially, would humiliate him, would create a scandal far worse than my refusal of you." "Then let there be scandal," Alaric replied fiercely. "Let all of London talk. Let them gossip and speculate and condemn. What does it matter? You will be mine, and I will ensure that no door is ever closed to you, that no drawing room is forbidden. I am powerful enough to weather any scandal, to force society to accept whatever I decree. Choose me, Isolde, not because it is safe or sensible or socially acceptable, but because you want to. Choose passion over comfort. Choose the risk of heartbreak over the certainty of emptiness." She wanted to say yes. Every fiber of her being yearned to step forward into his arms, to surrender to whatever this force was between them, to take the leap and trust that he would catch her rather than crush her. But years of hard-won independence, of fighting for her right to make her own choices, to live according to her own principles, held her back from that precipice. "I need time," she said finally. "I need to speak with Lord Hartley, to resolve this situation honorably, if it is to be resolved. I need to think clearly, without you standing before me making it impossible to form a rational thought. Will you grant me that, Your Grace? Will you give me time to make this decision properly?" Alaric was silent for a long moment, studying her face as if trying to memorize every detail. Then he stepped back, and she felt the loss of his proximity like a physical ache. "I will give you 1 week," he said, his voice once again controlled, though she could see the effort that control required. 1 week to decide whether you will spend your life with a man who offers you safety, or a man who offers you everything else. Choose wisely, Lady Isolde, for I will not ask again. If you refuse me a second time, I will accept your decision, and you will never see me again. But know this, if you choose me, I will spend every day of our lives together, ensuring you never regret that choice." He turned and left as abruptly as he had arrived, leaving Isolde alone in the library, with her thoughts in chaos and her heart pounding so hard she thought it might shatter her ribs. She sank into her chair, pressing shaking hands to her face, trying to sort through the tumult of emotions that threatened to overwhelm her entirely. The week that followed was the longest of Isolde's life. She called on Lord Hartley, intending to discuss the situation, to explain the impossible dilemma she faced, only to discover something that shifted everything she thought she understood. Lord Hartley received her in his study, his kind face showing concern at her obvious distress, and listened carefully as she stumbled through an explanation of Duke Alaric's return and his claims. "My dear Lady Isolde," he said gently when she finished, "I must confess something to you that I should perhaps have revealed earlier. When I first approached your father, seeking permission to court you, it was not entirely my own idea." Isolde stared at him, confusion momentarily overriding her distress. "I do not understand." Lord Hartley smiled ruefully. "I received a visit some months ago from the Duke of Renford. He told me about you, about your intelligence and spirit, about how you deserved better than to be pressured into a marriage you did not truly want. He suggested that you might benefit from the attentions of a gentleman who would court you properly, who would give you time and space to make your own choice, free from the weight of his overwhelming presence. He thought, you see, that if you had another option, a good option, you might begin to understand what you truly wanted." The room seemed to tilt around Isolde. "The Duke arranged our courtship?" "Not precisely arranged," Lord Hartley corrected. "I had admired you from a distance for some time, had been too timid to approach you, particularly given your reputation for refusing suitors. His Grace simply gave me the confidence to present myself, and suggested that my particular qualities might appeal to you. He also made it quite clear that if I mistreated you in any way, or attempted to manipulate you through this courtship, he would ensure I regretted it most profoundly." "But the proposal," Isolde stammered, her mind racing. "The engagement, you truly wish to marry me?" "I do wish to marry you," Lord Hartley said, his voice kind but also honest. "I have grown genuinely fond of you during our time together, and I believe we could have a comfortable, pleasant life together. But I am also not blind, Lady Isolde. I have seen the way you look when you think no one is watching, the way your mind drifts to places that have nothing to do with our conversations or plans, and I recognize the expression of a woman whose heart is engaged elsewhere even if she does not wish to admit it." Isolde felt tears burning behind her eyes. I do not wish to hurt you." "You have not hurt me," he assured her. "Disappointed me, perhaps, if I am honest, but not hurt me. I would far rather you be honest now than commit to a marriage while longing for someone else. That way lies misery for both of us." He paused, studying her with perceptive eyes. "May I offer you some advice, from someone who views this situation with perhaps more objectivity than you can currently manage?" She nodded, not trusting her voice. The Duke of Renford is not a comfortable man, nor an easy one. He is overwhelming and possessive, and accustomed to controlling everything around him. But in the months that I have come to know him, at least at a distance through our limited interactions, I have seen something I did not expect. He is utterly devoted to your happiness, even when that devotion meant arranging for you to have another option, even when it meant watching you court another man, even when it meant the possibility that you might choose someone else. That is not the behavior of a man interested only in possession or conquest. That is the behavior of a man who loves you, whether he can articulate it in those terms or not. "How can I trust that he will not try to control me?" Isolde whispered. "How can I risk my independence on the hope that he means what he says?" Lord Hartley smiled. "You cannot. That is the nature of love, I think. It requires a leap of faith, a willingness to be vulnerable, to trust that the other person will catch you rather than letting you fall. But I will say this. I have never seen the Duke look at anything the way he looks at you, and that sort of regard, Lady Isolde, is far rarer than comfortable companionship." She left Lord Hartley's house in a daze, her mind churning with revelations and recalculations. The Duke had arranged for her to have another option, had deliberately created a situation where she could choose freely, where the pressure of his presence and position would be removed. It was manipulative, certainly, the act of a man who moved people around like chess pieces, but it was also, she realized with dawning wonder, the act of a man who cared more about her happiness than his own pride, who was willing to risk losing her entirely rather than force her hand. The remaining days of the week passed in a blur of sleepless nights and endless internal debates. Isolde walked through London's parks, sat in her father's library surrounded by books that had been her constant companions, tried to imagine two different futures and determine which one she truly wanted. The safe choice was Lord Hartley, a comfortable life of mutual respect and pleasant companionship. The dangerous choice was Alaric, a life that might soar to unimaginable heights or crash into equally unimaginable depths, a constant challenge, a perpetual intensity, a love that terrified her precisely because of its power to consume everything she was. On the seventh day, Isolde rose before dawn and made her decision. She dressed with care in a simple morning gown of pale blue muslin, arranged her hair herself without calling for her maid, and wrote 2 letters with a hand that remained surprisingly steady despite the momentous nature of what she was committing to paper. The first went to Lord Hartley, thanking him for his kindness and understanding, formally releasing him from their engagement with profound apologies for any distress her decision might cause. The second was addressed to Duke Alaric Blackthorne, containing only a single line in her clear, elegant script. By mid-morning, she sat in the drawing room of the Pemberton townhouse, her hands folded in her lap, her heart beating with the slow, heavy rhythm of anticipation and determination. Her father had received the news of her broken engagement with his characteristic bemusement, asking only if she was certain this was what she wanted, accepting her assurance with a distracted pat on her hand before returning to his manuscripts. The servants had been instructed to admit the Duke immediately upon his arrival, and so she waited, feeling as if she stood once again on that precipice, but this time ready to leap. When the sound of hooves on cobblestones announced his arrival, when the door opened and Duke Alaric Blackthorne strode into the room with barely contained urgency, when his grey eyes found hers across the space that separated them, and she saw in them hope and fear and desperate longing, Isolde rose to her feet and spoke the words that would change both their lives irrevocably. "I choose you." The transformation that came over his face was something she knew she would remember until her dying day. The harsh lines softened, the tension drained from his shoulders, and for just a moment the fearsome Duke of Renford looked almost vulnerable, almost uncertain, as if he could not quite believe what he had heard. "Say it again," he said roughly, his voice catching on the words. I choose you, Alaric. Not because you are powerful or wealthy, not because you arranged alternatives or gave me time to decide, but because despite all my fear and all my determination to remain independent, I cannot imagine my life without you in it. Because when you left this room a week ago, you took something vital with you, and I have felt incomplete ever since, because I would rather risk everything with you than accept safety with anyone else. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, pulling her into his arms with a force that drove the breath from her lungs, holding her as if he feared she might vanish if he loosened his grip even slightly. His face buried in her hair, and she felt him trembling, felt the shuddering breath he drew, felt the way his arms tightened around her until she could barely breathe, but found she did not care, did not want him to ever let go. I will make mistakes, he said against her hair, his voice muffled but fierce. I will be too possessive, too demanding, too accustomed to having my own way. I will frustrate you and anger you and make you want to throw things at my arrogant head. But I swear to you, Isolde, I swear on everything I have and everything I am, that I will spend every day of our lives together trying to deserve you, trying to be worthy of the trust you are placing in me. She pulled back just enough to look up at him, reaching up to touch his face with trembling fingers, tracing the sharp line of his jaw, the high arch of his cheekbone, seeing the man beneath the reputation for perhaps the first time. And I will challenge you and provoke you and refuse to be managed or controlled. I will express opinions you do not agree with and make decisions you do not approve of and insist on maintaining parts of my life that are mine alone. Can you truly accept that? Can you love a woman who will not simply acquiesce to your will? His smile, when it came, was brilliant and genuine, transforming his severe features into something almost boyish. I do not want acquiescence. I never did. I want you exactly as you are, fierce and brilliant and impossible. I want to argue with you at breakfast and make love to you at night and spend every moment in between discovering new depths to your remarkable mind. I want partnership and passion and the knowledge that the woman beside me chose to be there rather than being coerced or purchased with my title and fortune. Then you shall have it, she whispered, and then his mouth was on hers, kissing her with a hunger that stole whatever remained of her breath, pouring into that kiss all the weeks of separation and longing and desperate hope. She kissed him back with equal fervor, her hands sliding into his hair, feeling it spring thick and alive between her fingers, tasting him, learning him, claiming him as thoroughly as he was claiming her. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, foreheads pressed together, Isolde found herself laughing, pure joy bubbling up from somewhere deep inside. We are going to create the most terrible scandal, you realize. Broken engagement, hasty marriage to the man I refused less than a year ago. All of society will have opinions, and none of them flattering. Let them talk, Alaric said, his arms still locked around her waist, his eyes bright with something that looked remarkably like happiness. Let them whisper and speculate and condemn. I have you, and that is worth more than all their good opinion combined. The wedding took place 3 weeks later, in a private ceremony at Blackthorn Hall, attended only by Lord Edmund and a handful of Alaric's closest associates. Society did indeed talk, as predicted, the gossip mills churning with speculation about what could have caused Lady Isolde to break her engagement to the respectable Lord Hartley and throw herself into the arms of the Duke, who had supposedly been devastated by her initial refusal. Some claimed she had been playing a long game all along, deliberately creating drama to increase her value in the marriage market. Others insisted the Duke had compromised her reputation and forced the marriage to salvage what remained of her honor. Still others whispered that it was a love match of the most passionate and scandalous variety, and those whispers for once came closest to the truth. The early months of their marriage were not easy. Alaric had not exaggerated when he warned that he would be possessive and demanding. He struggled with her insistence on maintaining her own pursuits, on spending hours in the library engaged in scholarly work that had nothing to do with running his households or supporting his political ambitions. He found it difficult to accept that she would argue with him in front of his business associates, that she would express opinions on matters he considered his domain, that she refused to simply nod and agree when he made pronouncements about how things should be managed. But he was also learning slowly and with visible effort to bend rather than break, to compromise rather than command. When she retreated to the library for days at a time, working on an essay about economic reform that she intended to publish anonymously, he found himself drawn to join her, initially to ensure she was eating properly and not exhausting herself, but gradually because he enjoyed watching her work, enjoyed the discussions they had when she would look up from her papers and challenge his assumptions about labor practices or agricultural improvements. When she insisted on accompanying him to a political dinner, and then proceeded to hold her own in a debate about the Corn Laws with several members of Parliament, arguing passionately for positions he himself opposed, he felt a surge of pride so intense it surprised him, even as he publicly disagreed with every word she said. Isolde, for her part, discovered that loving Alaric Blackthorne was like holding lightning, exhilarating and dangerous in equal measure. He could be tender beyond anything she had imagined, then demanding beyond her ability to yield. He could frustrate her to the point of fury with his arrogance, then disarm her completely with unexpected vulnerability. He challenged her intellectually in ways no one ever had, pushed her to refine her arguments, to think more deeply, to defend positions she had previously taken for granted. He also desired her with an intensity that sometimes frightened her with its power, as if he wanted to consume her entirely, body and soul. Learning to navigate that desire, to meet it without losing herself, to give while also taking, became its own education. 6 months into their marriage, they had their first truly serious argument. Alaric had made a business decision regarding one of his manufacturing concerns, implementing practices that Isolde considered exploitative of the workers, prioritizing profit over human welfare. She had confronted him in his study, armed with facts and figures and moral arguments, and he had dismissed her concerns with exactly the sort of aristocratic arrogance that made her blood boil. "You do not understand business, Isolde," he had said, not even looking up from the papers on his desk. "These decisions are complex, involving factors you have not considered. I appreciate your concern for the workers, but sentiment cannot govern commercial enterprises." Sentiment. She had repeated the word with dangerous quiet. "You think it is mere sentiment to believe that men who labor 12 hours a day in dangerous conditions deserve wages sufficient to feed their families. You think it is sentiment to oppose practices that destroy their health and spirit for the sake of increasing your already obscene profits by a few percentage points. I think," he had replied, finally looking up with irritation clear on his face, "that you are allowing your emotions to cloud your judgment. The wages I pay are standard for the industry. If I increase them, I lose my competitive advantage and potentially put the entire enterprise at risk, costing those workers their employment entirely." "Or perhaps," she had shot back, her voice rising despite her determination to remain calm, "if you paid decent wages and improved conditions, your workers would be healthier, more productive, and more loyal, ultimately benefiting your profits while also allowing you to look at yourself in the mirror without shame. But that would require you to view them as human beings rather than simply resources to be exploited." The argument had escalated from there, both of them saying things in the heat of anger that they would later regret, until finally Isolde had thrown up her hands in frustration and stormed from the room, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the windows. She had retreated to her chambers, too furious to even cry, pacing like a caged animal and wondering if she had made a catastrophic mistake, if the man she had married was truly as heartless as he had seemed in those moments. Hours later, well past midnight, Alaric had appeared in her doorway. He looked haggard, his hair disheveled from running his hands through it, his cravat loosened, his eyes shadowed with something that might have been regret. He had stood there for a long moment, just looking at her, and then had spoken with a humility she had never heard from him before. "I have spent the past 4 hours reviewing the accounts and conditions at my factories," he said quietly. "I also sent for my foreman and questioned him extensively about worker complaints and concerns. You were right, about all of it. I have been willfully blind to suffering that occurs under my name, prioritizing profit margins over human dignity, telling myself that standard industry practice absolves me of moral responsibility. It does not, and I am ashamed." Isolde had stared at him, shocked into silence. "I am implementing changes immediately," he continued. moving into the room but keeping his distance as if afraid she might reject his approach. Reduced hours, increased wages, improved safety measures. It will cost me considerably in the short term, though I suspect you are correct that it will ultimately prove beneficial in ways that extend beyond simple profit calculation. But even if it does not, even if it costs me, I will do it because you have shown me that I was wrong, and because I would rather be a man you can respect than one who simply accumulates wealth without regard for how it is obtained. She had gone to him then, all her anger evaporating in the face of his admission, his willingness to truly hear her and change his actions accordingly. "It is not easy for you," she had said softly, taking his hands in hers, "to admit when you are wrong, to alter course, to submit your judgment to someone else's evaluation. I know what it costs you." "It costs me nothing compared to the thought of losing your respect," he had replied, pulling her close. "You are my conscience, Isolde, the better angel of my nature. I need you to keep challenging me, keep forcing me to examine my assumptions, keep reminding me that power carries responsibility beyond the merely legal. Promise me you will never stop arguing with me when you believe I am wrong, even if it means we spend half our marriage in furious debate." She had promised, and he had carried her to their bed, and they had reconciled with a passion that left them both breathless and tangled together in the darkness, whispering confessions and promises, and all the words that they still found difficult to say in the light of day. The seasons turned, and with them their relationship deepened into something neither had quite anticipated. Alaric discovered that having a true partner, someone who challenged and inspired him, made his life immeasurably richer than the isolated existence he had maintained before. Isolde discovered that surrendering to love did not mean sacrificing her independence, that she could be fully herself while also being completely his, that the two were not contradictory, but complementary. They developed routines and rituals that belonged only to them, breakfast discussions that ranged from philosophy to politics to gossip about their acquaintances, conducted with the intellectual rigor of parliamentary debates. Long walks through the grounds of Blackthorn Hall, where they could speak freely without the constraints of servants or social obligations. Evenings in the library, sometimes reading separately but in companionable silence, sometimes engaged in spirited arguments about whatever text had captured their attention. Nights where passion overtook them, where they learned each other's bodies with the same intensity they brought to learning each other's minds, where Alaric could be vulnerable in ways he showed no one else, where Isolde could be demanding and fierce and utterly shameless in her desires. They also began working together on projects that combined their strengths. Alaric's business acumen and resources with Isolde's social consciousness and analytical mind produced initiatives that improved conditions for workers across multiple industries, that established schools for the children of laborers, that challenged other wealthy industrialists to examine their own practices. They hosted intellectual salons at their London residence, gatherings that mixed nobility with scholars and reformers, where real discussions occurred rather than the vapid social chatter that characterized most aristocratic entertainments. Isolde wrote essays that were published under pseudonyms but whispered to be her work, essays that influenced policy debates and shifted public opinion. Alaric used his considerable political influence to support reforms he would have dismissed as radical idealism before his marriage. Society gradually adjusted to the unconventional Duchess of Renford, though opinions remained divided. Some continued to view Isolde as scandalous, inappropriate, too bold and outspoken for a woman of her position. Others, particularly younger women who chafed against society's restrictions, saw in her a model of what might be possible, proof that a woman could maintain her own identity and pursuits, even within marriage to a powerful man. The Duke and Duchess largely ignored society's opinions, secure enough in their own partnership to care little for external validation. It was in their second year of marriage that the event occurred, which would test their relationship more profoundly than any argument or external challenge had yet done. Alaric received word that his younger brother, whom he had not seen in over a decade following a bitter estrangement over family matters, had died in a riding accident. The brother had left behind a young daughter, barely 8 years old, with no other living relatives. As the child's uncle and guardian, Alaric was legally responsible for her care. Isolde watched her husband receive this news with a composure that she had learned to recognize as his response to emotional upheaval, the absolute control he imposed when his feelings threatened to overwhelm him. He made arrangements with characteristic efficiency, dispatching servants to collect the child, preparing rooms at Blackthorn Hall, consulting with his solicitors about financial provisions. But he said nothing about his brother, about their shared history, about the grief or guilt or whatever complex tangle of emotions he must surely be experiencing. When young Lady Charlotte Blackthorn arrived at Blackthorn Hall, a small, pale child with enormous eyes and her deceased mother's dark curls, clutching a worn doll as if it were her only anchor in a suddenly unstable world, Isolde felt her heart break for the frightened little girl who had lost everything. She knelt before Charlotte, speaking gently, trying to offer comfort without overwhelming her with unwanted sympathy. The child remained silent, withdrawn into herself, neither crying nor speaking, simply staring at her surroundings with the numb incomprehension of profound shock. Alaric maintained his distance, speaking to his niece with formal correctness but no warmth, ensuring she had everything she needed materially, but offering nothing of himself emotionally. Isolde tried to discuss it with him, to understand why he was treating this grieving child with such coldness, but he deflected her questions with increasing curtness until she finally confronted him directly. "She is 8 years old and has lost both her parents," Isolde said, her voice sharp with frustration and concern. "She is alone and frightened, and she needs someone to care for her, truly care for her, not simply house and feed her like a pet you have inherited. Why are you being so cold toward her?" "I am providing everything necessary for her welfare," Alaric replied, his face set in the hard lines she had learned meant he was retreating behind his walls. "She will have the best education, the finest governess, every material advantage. What more would you have me do?" "Love her." The words burst from Isolde with passionate intensity. "Or at least try to comfort her. Show her some human warmth instead of this glacial formality. She is your brother's child, your family, and she is suffering." "My brother," Alaric said, his voice dropping to something cold and flat, "chose to cut all ties with me years ago over matters you know nothing about. I owe his child proper care and provision, which she will receive. I do not owe her affection I do not feel." "You feel it," Isolde insisted, moving closer, trying to see past the armor he had erected. "I see it in the way you avoid looking at her, the way you leave rooms when she enters, the way your hands clench whenever her name is mentioned. You are not indifferent, you are afraid." "I am not discussing this further," he said, turning away from her, dismissing the conversation with the absolute authority he employed when he wanted a matter closed. But Isolde was not so easily dismissed. She spent time with Charlotte, reading to her, talking to her gently about anything that might penetrate the child's silence, simply sitting with her in companionable quiet when words seemed impossible. Slowly, gradually, Charlotte began to emerge from her shell, first speaking in whispers, then asking careful questions, finally beginning to show hints of the bright, curious girl she must have been before tragedy devastated her world. She followed Isolde through the house, a small shadow attached to the only person who had shown her genuine kindness, and Isolde felt her own protective instincts engage in ways that surprised her with their intensity. One evening, perhaps 6 weeks after Charlotte's arrival, Isolde found the child standing outside Alaric's study, clearly wanting to knock but paralyzed by uncertainty and fear of rejection. Isolde approached gently, kneeling beside her. "Would you like to see your uncle?" she asked softly. Charlotte nodded, tears gathering in her eyes. "I wanted to tell him about my lessons. My governess said I did very well with my mathematics today, and I thought perhaps he might want to know. Father always liked when I did well with my studies, but Uncle seems so stern, so angry all the time, as if he wishes I were not here." Isolde felt something fierce and protective rise in her chest. "He is not angry at you, darling. I promise you that. He is angry at himself, at circumstances, at things that have nothing to do with you, but you are right that he should know about your accomplishments. Come, we shall tell him together." She took Charlotte's small hand in hers and knocked firmly on the study door, entering without waiting for permission in a breach of their usual protocols. Alaric looked up from his papers with surprise that shifted quickly to something more guarded when he saw his niece. "Charlotte has something she wishes to share with you," Isolde said, her voice pleasant but carrying an undertone that suggested this conversation would happen whether he wished it or not. She guided the child forward gently, then positioned herself slightly behind, offering silent support. Charlotte stood before her uncle's massive desk, looking impossibly small and vulnerable, and spoke in a voice that wavered but did not break. "I wanted to tell you that I did well with my mathematics today. 16 sums and I got them all correct. Father used to say that mathematics were important, that they taught one to think logically about problems. I thought you might want to know." Alaric stared at his niece, and Isolde watched with her heart in her throat as something cracked in his carefully maintained composure. His jaw worked as if he were trying to speak, but could not find words. His hands, resting on the desk, had begun to tremble slightly. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with suppressed emotion. "Your father was right. Mathematics are very important." He paused, seemed to struggle with himself, then continued with visible effort. "He was always better at them than I was, you know. When we were boys, he could solve problems in his head that took me considerable time with paper and pen. I envied him that facility." Charlotte's eyes had widened. "You were boys together? You and father?" "We were." Alaric's composure was fracturing visibly now, pain bleeding through the cracks. "We were brothers and we were close once, closer than I have been to anyone except your aunt. We played together, studied together, got into trouble together. And then we grew up and let foolish pride and stubborn anger destroy what we had built. And now he is gone, and I can never tell him that I was sorry, that I regretted our estrangement every day, that I wished 1,000 times I had been less proud and more willing to bend." The tears he had been holding back finally spilled over, and the Duke of Renford, the man who never showed weakness, who never admitted defeat, sat at his desk and wept for his lost brother, while his niece watched with dawning understanding. Isolde moved forward instinctively, placing a hand on his shoulder, but it was Charlotte who truly acted, running around the desk to throw small arms around her uncle's neck, her own tears flowing freely now. "Father talked about you too," she said through her sobs. "He told me stories about when you were boys. He told me you were the bravest person he knew, that you protected him when larger boys bullied him at school, that you taught him to ride even though you were afraid of horses yourself when you were small. He said he missed you. He said he wished things had been different." Alaric pulled his niece close, holding her as if she were something precious and fragile that might shatter if he let go. "I am not good at this," he said, his voice muffled against her hair. "I do not know how to care for a child. I do not know how to be what you need. But I want to try, Charlotte. I want to learn. Will you help me? Will you be patient with me while I figure out how to be the uncle you deserve?" "Yes," Charlotte whispered. "I will try too. I will try to be good and not make you sorry you have to take care of me." "You could never make me sorry," Alaric said fiercely. "You are all I have left of my brother, all I have left of my family besides your aunt. You are precious to me, Charlotte, even if I have been too foolish and too locked in my own grief to show it properly." Isolde stood back and watched the two of them cling to each other, both crying, both healing something that had been broken, and felt her own tears flowing freely down her cheeks. This was her husband at his most vulnerable, his most human, stripped of all the armor and arrogance that he presented to the world, simply a man grieving his brother and trying to care for the child left behind. This was what she had always known existed beneath his harsh exterior, the capacity for deep feeling and genuine love that he protected so carefully because it made him vulnerable in ways his pride could not easily accept. From that evening forward, the dynamic in Blackthorn Hall shifted fundamentally. Alaric began spending time with Charlotte, initially awkward and uncertain, but gradually more comfortable as he learned to navigate the particular challenges of caring for a grieving child. He read to her in the evenings, terrible adventure stories that made her giggle and beg for just one more chapter. He took her riding, teaching her with patient care despite his own early fears of horses, sharing stories of her father's prowess on horseback. He consulted with her about redecorating her rooms, actually listening to her opinions and implementing her suggestions even when they involved colors he personally found garish. He became slowly but unmistakably Not just her guardian, but her uncle in the fullest sense of that word. Someone who cared for her welfare and delighted in her company and wanted her to thrive. Isolde watched this transformation with a heart full to overflowing, seeing her husband become someone softer, more open, more willing to show the love that had always existed beneath his controlled exterior. He was learning, just as he had learned to accept her challenges to his business practices, just as he had learned to value her partnership over domination, to let people past his defenses, to trust that vulnerability would not destroy him, but rather make him stronger, more complete, more fully human, more fully. One night, perhaps 3 months after Charlotte's arrival, as they lay together in the darkness of their bedchamber, Alaric spoke the words that Isolde had been waiting to hear, words she had never pushed him toward, because she knew they had to come from his own recognition rather than external pressure. "I love you," he said quietly, his arms tightening around her. "I have loved you since that first evening, when you challenged my assumptions and refused to be intimidated by my reputation. I loved you when you refused my proposal, though I could not admit it even to myself at the time. I loved you when you chose me, despite all the excellent reasons you had to choose safety instead. I love you now, more deeply than I knew it was possible to love another person, so thoroughly that the thought of existing without you fills me with a terror I cannot fully articulate. You have transformed me, Isolde. You have made me better than I was, challenged me to examine my life and find it wanting, forced me to grow and change in ways I would have resisted if anyone else had suggested them. You are my partner, my conscience, my greatest treasure, and I love you with everything I am." Isolde felt tears sliding down her cheeks as she pressed her face against his chest, feeling his heart beating strong and steady beneath her cheek. "I love you too," she whispered. "I have loved you longer than I wanted to admit, feared that love because of its power, tried to protect myself from its intensity, but I am done being afraid, done holding back. I love you, Alaric Blackthorne, with your arrogance and your occasional tyranny and your stubborn pride. I love you for your intelligence and your passion and your capacity to grow and change. I love you for the man you are and the man you are becoming, and I cannot imagine my life without you in it." They made love that night, with a tenderness that was new between them, a slow exploration that spoke of permanence and commitment, and the deep security of knowing they were choosing each other, had chosen each other, would continue choosing each other through whatever challenges life might present. It was not the desperate passion of their early days together, nor the fierce intensity of their reconciliations after arguments. It was something deeper, richer, more enduring, the physical expression of a love that had been tested and refined and emerged stronger for the testing. The years that followed were not without their challenges. Alaric still struggled with his need for control, still made decisions without consultation that infuriated Isolde and required lengthy discussions and sometimes heated arguments before he acknowledged his error. Isolde still insisted on pursuing projects and interests that he considered inappropriate for a duchess, still expressed opinions in public that made him wince and defend her against critics who thought she needed managing. But they had learned how to fight productively, how to challenge each other without diminishing each other, how to disagree passionately while still respecting the fundamental partnership they had built. Charlotte thrived under their combined care, growing from a traumatized child into a confident young woman who possessed her father's mathematical brilliance and her aunt's fierce independence. She watched her uncle and aunt navigate their complex relationship with the shrewd intelligence of youth, learning from their example what a true partnership could look like, what it meant to love someone while also remaining fully oneself. When she eventually made her own debut in society, she did so with a confidence and self-possession that scandalized some and impressed others, clearly the product of being raised by two people who valued authenticity over conformity. Isolde and Alaric also expanded their family, though not without considerable anxiety on both their parts. The birth of their first child, a son they named Edmund after Isolde's father, was a revelation for Alaric, who had not expected to feel such overwhelming love and terror in equal measure for this tiny person who depended entirely on their care. He was a devoted, if somewhat anxious father, constantly hovering and worrying, needing Isolde to remind him that children were more resilient than he feared, that Edmund would not shatter simply because Alaric held him with slightly less than perfect expertise. Their daughter arrived 2 years later, named Helena for Alaric's mother, and proved to have inherited both her mother's intelligence and her father's intense grey eyes, a combination that promised she would be formidable in her own right. The Duke and Duchess of Renford became known throughout England, not just for their wealth and position, but for the genuinely revolutionary nature of their partnership, for the way they had transformed each other and, by extension, influenced others to examine their own relationships and assumptions. Other women began to push back more firmly against society's restrictions, citing the Duchess as proof that a woman could maintain her independence within marriage. Other men of power began to question their own practices, to consider whether wealth divorced from responsibility was truly success, to think about legacy in terms beyond mere accumulation of resources. They grew older together, their children growing up and making their own way in the world, Charlotte marrying a gentleman scholar who valued her brilliant mind and supported her own mathematical research. Edmund proved to have his mother's social conscience combined with his father's business acumen, using his position to continue and expand the reforms his parents had begun. Helena, true to expectations, became a formidable force in her own right, refusing multiple advantageous proposals, before finally choosing a man who could match her intelligence and spirit, much as her mother had done a generation earlier. Through all the years and changes, through the inevitable losses and disappointments that accompany any life fully lived, Alaric and Isolde remained partners in the deepest sense of that word. They still argued, still challenged each other, still found new sources of friction and new depths to explore in their relationship. But they had built something enduring, something that transcended the passion of their early days to become a love that was both comfortable and exciting, familiar and surprising, as essential as breathing and as remarkable as any force of nature. On the occasion of their 25th anniversary, Alaric arranged for them to return to Blackthorn Hall during the autumn season, when the leaves turned gold and russet and the air carried that particular crispness that promised winter's approach. They walked through the grounds together, their pace slower than it had been in their youth, but their companionship richer for all the years of shared experience. "Do you ever regret it?" Alaric asked, as they paused by the lake, where he had first told Charlotte stories of her father, where they had taught their children to skip stones, where so many significant moments of their life together had occurred. "Choosing me, I mean. Choosing the uncertain, difficult path over the safe one." Isolde looked at him, seeing the silver threading through his dark hair now, the lines around his eyes that spoke of laughter as much as worry, the softening of features that age had brought without diminishing his essential character. She thought of all the years they had shared, the arguments and reconciliations, the moments of transcendent joy and crushing sorrow, the ordinary days and the extraordinary ones, all woven together into the rich tapestry of a life fully lived. "Not once," she said firmly, taking his hand in hers. "Not in 25 years have I regretted choosing you, choosing us, choosing this gloriously complicated life we have built together. You have frustrated me, certainly, made me furiously angry more times than I can count, challenged me and provoked me, and occasionally made me want to lock you out of our bedchamber for a week. But you have also loved me, supported me, encouraged me to be more than I thought I could be, created space for me to flourish, even when it meant setting aside your own preferences and pride. You have been my greatest adventure, Alaric Blackthorn, and I would choose you again in every life, in every circumstance, without hesitation or regret." He pulled her close, kissing her with the same intensity he had brought to their first kiss all those years ago in her father's library, and she responded with equal passion, neither of them caring that they were visible from the house, that servants might see that they were supposed to have achieved the dignified restraint appropriate to their age and position. They had never cared much for what they were supposed to do, and they were not about to start now. "I chose well when I decided to pursue you," Alaric murmured against her lips, "though I suspect I should more properly say that you chose well when you decided to take a chance on me, despite all evidence suggesting I would be impossible to live with." "You are impossible to live with," Isolde agreed, laughing. "Arrogant, demanding, occasionally tyrannical, stubborn beyond all reason. But you are also brave and brilliant and capable of depths of feeling that take my breath away. You are mine, Alaric, as I am yours, and that is all that truly matters." They stood there together as the sun set over the grounds of Blackthorn Hall, casting everything in shades of amber and gold, two people who had found in each other something rare and precious, a love that had survived its own intensity to become something even more powerful, a partnership that had withstood every test and emerged stronger for the testing. As darkness began to fall and the first stars appeared in the deepening sky, they turned back toward the house together, hand in hand, ready to face whatever the future might bring with the same courage and conviction that had brought them this far. Behind them, the lake reflected the dying light, holding in its still waters the memory of all that had been and the promise of all that was yet to come. The story of Duke Alaric Blackthorn and Lady Isolde Pemberton became one of those rare tales that transcended their own time, whispered across generations as proof that true love, real partnership, required courage and compromise, passion and patience, the willingness to risk everything for the possibility of something extraordinary. It was not a fairy tale with a simple ending, but rather a complex, nuanced narrative of two strong-willed individuals who chose each other repeatedly, in small moments and large ones, through triumph and tragedy, building something together that neither could have created alone. Years later, when their grandchildren would ask how they had known, how they had been certain that choosing each other was the right decision despite all the obstacles and uncertainties, Isolde would smile and exchange a look with Alaric that spoke of shared memories and private understanding. "We did not know," she would say honestly, "not with the certainty that comes from logic or careful calculation, but we trusted in the possibility, in the potential we saw in each other, and in what we might become together. Your grandfather taught me that safety is sometimes just another word for settling, for accepting less than what your heart truly desires, because you are afraid to reach for more. And I taught him that love is not about possession or conquest, but about creating space for another person to flourish while flourishing alongside them. She also taught me," Alaric would add with the dry humor that had mellowed with age but never disappeared, "that being right is far less important than being happy, and that a woman who challenges you is infinitely more valuable than one who simply agrees with everything you say. Though I will deny having said that if anyone asks, as I have a reputation to maintain." Their grandchildren would laugh, watching the way their grandmother would swat playfully at their grandfather's arm, the way his eyes would crinkle with genuine amusement, the way they moved around each other with the unconscious coordination of people who had shared space and life for so long that they had become, in some essential way, two halves of a single whole. But perhaps the truest measure of what Alaric and Isolde had built together came not from their own words or the observations of others, but from the choices their children and grandchildren made in their own lives. They chose partners for love rather than advantage, valued intelligence and character over wealth and position, insisted on maintaining their own identities within their marriages, refused to settle for anything less than genuine partnership. The example set by the Duke and Duchess of Renford rippled outward through their family and beyond, influencing countless others to examine their own relationships and ask themselves whether they were truly choosing love or simply accepting what society deemed appropriate. The final chapter of their story came many years later, when both had reached the age where mortality could no longer be ignored or postponed. Alaric, who had always been so strong, so seemingly indestructible, began to fail in the way that age eventually brings even the most powerful men to their knees. His mind remained sharp until nearly the end, but his body gradually betrayed him, forcing him to accept limitations he had never known before, to rely on others in ways that his proud nature found almost unbearable. Isolde remained by his side through it all, refusing to leave him even when their children gently suggested she might want to rest, to take care of herself, to accept that the end was approaching, whether she acknowledged it or not. She read to him when his eyes grew too weak to read for himself, held his hand through long nights when pain made sleep impossible, reminded him of all the years they had shared, all the love they had built, all the reasons his life had mattered far beyond the accumulation of wealth and power that had once seemed so important. "I am not ready," he told her one evening, his voice barely a whisper, his hand trembling in hers. "I am not ready to leave you, to lose all of this, to step into whatever darkness waits beyond. I have had a good life, a better life than I deserved, But I am not done. There is so much more I want to say to you, so many more days I want to share." "Then say what you need to say," Isolde replied, her own voice thick with tears she refused to shed while he could see them. "I am listening, my love. I will always listen." He gathered what remained of his strength, his grey eyes finding hers with the same intensity they had held on that first evening so many decades ago. "Thank you," he said simply, "for refusing me that first time, for forcing me to become someone worthy of choosing, for choosing me anyway when I had done nothing to deserve it except want you desperately enough to be willing to change, for challenging me every day of our marriage, for never letting me become complacent or comfortable with being less than I could be, for loving me, not the duke or the fortune or the power, but the man beneath all of that, the frightened boy who had learned to hide behind arrogance and control because he did not know how else to protect himself. You saved me, Isolde. You gave me a life worth living, a love worth having, a reason to be better than I was. And I love you. I have loved you from the beginning, will love you until my last breath and beyond into whatever comes after. I love you. I love you too, she whispered, leaning forward to press her forehead against his, feeling him still warm and present, even as she felt him slipping away. I love you, Alaric, my impossible, arrogant, wonderful love. Thank you for fighting for me, for us, for refusing to accept my rejection and making me face what I truly wanted. Thank you for learning how to bend without breaking, for becoming the partner I needed even when it cost you to do so. Thank you for 25 years of adventure and passion and genuine partnership. Thank you for loving me enough to let me be fully myself. Thank you for everything. He died that night, quietly, peacefully, with her hand in his and her voice the last thing he heard, as she told him stories of their life together, reminding him of all the love they had built, all the joy they had shared, promising him that she would be all right, that their children and grandchildren would thrive, that the legacy they had created together would endure long after they were both gone. Isolde survived him by 3 years, long enough to ensure their family was settled, to finish projects they had begun together, to write down the story of their love for their descendants so that future generations might understand how rare and precious true partnership could be. She spoke of him often, keeping his memory alive through anecdotes and observations, refusing to let grief dim her recollection of all that had been good between them. When her own time came, she faced it with the same courage she had brought to every other challenge in her life. Her children and grandchildren gathered around her bedside, and she gave them final words of wisdom distilled from a lifetime of learning. Love is not easy, she told them, her voice fading but her words clear. Real love, the kind that lasts and grows and transforms you, requires courage and compromise and the willingness to be vulnerable even when vulnerability terrifies you. It requires choosing the same person repeatedly, in small moments and large ones, even when they frustrate you beyond bearing. It requires honesty, especially about the difficult things, the things you would rather hide or ignore. But it is worth every moment of struggle, every argument, every instance of having to swallow your pride and admit you were wrong. Your grandfather was the love of my life, the great adventure that defined everything that came after choosing him. I regret nothing except that we did not have even more time together. Choose love when you find it. Choose the person who challenges you to grow, who sees you truly and loves you anyway, who makes you want to be better than you are. And when you find that person, hold on with everything you have, because that is the greatest treasure any of us ever get in this life. She died peacefully that night, and those who tended her in her final moments said that she seemed to smile just before the end, as if she saw something or someone waiting for her beyond the veil of mortality. Perhaps she did. Perhaps Alaric was there, as impossibly handsome and arrogant as he had been in his prime, extending his hand and offering her one more adventure, one more journey to take together. Perhaps they walked off into whatever comes next side by side, still arguing and laughing and loving each other with the same intensity they had brought to their earthly existence. Or perhaps it was simply the peaceful ending of a life well lived, a woman who had loved deeply and been deeply loved in return, who had changed the world in small but significant ways, who had built something enduring out of passion and partnership and the courage to risk everything for the possibility of something extraordinary. The truth, like the truth of all great love stories, lies somewhere beyond facts and evidence, in the realm of feeling and faith and the stubborn human insistence that love matters, that connection transcends mortality, that what is built between two souls endures beyond the limits of flesh and time. What remains indisputable is the legacy they left behind. Their children and grandchildren carried forward the lessons learned from watching two strong-willed individuals create a genuine partnership. The reforms they had championed continued to spread, improving lives across England and beyond. The story of their love became one of those tales that mothers told daughters and fathers told sons, an example of what was possible when courage met passion, when independence found a way to coexist with devotion, when two people chose each other not despite their differences, but because of them. The estates they had tended so carefully continued to thrive under new stewardship. The libraries they had filled with books welcomed new generations of readers. The gardens they had walked together through every season continued to bloom and fade and bloom again, marking the passage of time with botanical faithfulness. And in the family chapel at Blackthorn Hall, two marble effigies lay side by side, hands reaching toward each other across the small space that separated them, frozen forever in that moment of reaching, of choosing, of love. The inscription carved beneath them was simple, chosen by their children to capture the essence of what their parents had built together across decades of marriage and partnership. It read simply, "They chose each other, and in choosing became more than they had been alone." And so ends the story of Duke Alaric Blackthorn and Lady Isolde Pemberton, two people who defied expectations and social conventions to build something rare and precious, a love that grew stronger rather than dimmer with the passage of time, a partnership that transformed not just themselves but everyone they touched. Their story reminds us that the greatest adventures are not always found in distant lands or dramatic events, but sometimes in the daily choice to love another person fully, to allow ourselves to be transformed by that love, to build something together that neither could create alone. It was not always easy. It was often messy and complicated and challenging in ways that tested them both to their limits and beyond. But it was real and it was theirs, and it endured in ways that wealth and power never could, leaving a legacy measured not in gold or property or titles, but in the lives they touched, the love they shared, and the example they set for all who came after. Some stories end with happily ever after, as if happiness were a destination reached and maintained without effort. But the story of Alaric and Isolde teaches us something different, something truer. They did not live happily ever after. They lived passionately, courageously, authentically, choosing each other and their partnership every day, through happiness and sorrow, triumph and tragedy, until death itself could not diminish what they had built together. And that, perhaps, is the truest happy ending of all. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this emotional journey. If this story touched your heart, we invite you to subscribe, like, comment, and share our channel. Your support inspires us to keep creating more stories of love, redemption, and breathtaking twists. Help us reach our first 1,000 subscribers, and together we will continue sharing tales that warm the heart. At the end of this video, you will see a suggestion for another of our historical stories. Click and let yourself be enchanted by another unforgettable tale. With all our gratitude, Echoes of Romance.